Welcome to our channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our spooky stories. My name is Daniel, and I never believed in horror stories. I always thought they were just tales to scare children or sell books and movies. But what happened in the small coastal town of Harbor's End completely changed my perspective. Harbor's End is a place that looks like it's straight out of a painting. Wooden houses with decorated porches, fishing boats gently swaying in the harbor, and the constant sound of waves crashing against the rocks. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other, and doors are always unlocked. Or, at least, it was like that until the disappearances started. It all began subtly. First, it was a local fisherman, Jim Holloway, who didn't return from a night of fishing. At first, everyone thought he had gotten lost at sea. It was a possibility, considering the treacherous waters of the region. But then, it was the turn of young Emily Carter, who was returning home after visiting a friend. She never reached her destination. Her car was found parked by the roadside, the doors unlocked, but with no sign of her. As days went by, more people started to vanish. An elderly couple who enjoyed walking along the beach at dusk, a teenager who went out for a morning run, a mother who was just shopping at the local market. The stories repeated themselves, but with no explanation. There were no signs of struggle, no trace of where they might have gone. It was as if they had evaporated into thin air. The town, which was once a refuge of tranquility, began to be dominated by fear. Residents avoided going out after sunset. Children were kept close to their parents, and even the dogs seemed to sense the terror in the air. Everyone had a theory, but no one knew for sure what was happening. Some people spoke of abductions, others of a serial killer on the loose, but nothing made sense. And then, the voices began. It was on a cold, moonless night that the first voice was heard. Peter, an old fisherman, was on the porch of his house when he heard a whisper coming from the sea. It was a soft voice, almost melodic, calling his name. He told his wife the next day, but she just laughed, saying he was imagining things. However, the next night, more people heard the same voice. It was seductive, hypnotic, promising hidden secrets and riches beyond imagination. At first, people tried to ignore it. But those who heard the voice often seemed to fall into a trance, walking to the beach like sleepwalkers. Those who responded to the call were never seen again. Desperate, the residents began to barricade their doors and windows in an attempt to block out the sound. But the voice found a way to infiltrate, either through the smallest holes or through the very minds of the inhabitants. It was as if the town was under a dark spell, a nightmare from which we could not wake up. And fear turned into despair, for everyone knew that any night, the voice could call for them. And so, the silent terror continued to spread through Harbor's End, a town now dominated by the fear of the unknown, while the dark waters of the sea hid secrets that no one dared to uncover. I am Hannah, and I was one of the first to hear the voice. I was always skeptical about the supernatural, but what I experienced that night still gives me chills to this day. It was an especially cold night in Harbor's End. The fog rolled in from the sea, enveloping the town in an opaque and damp shroud. I was on the porch of my house, vainly trying to pick up some radio signal on the old antenna, when I heard it for the first time. It was a soft voice, almost a whisper, yet clear and insistent. Hannah, ere it called, my name echoing like a hypnotic chant. At first, I thought it was someone playing a prank, but the voice was strangely alluring, as if it were inside my head. I tried to ignore it, but curiosity overcame fear, and I took a few steps toward the sea, trying to see who was calling. It was then that I realized there was no one there. Just the waves gently breaking on the deserted beach. In the following days, other people reported hearing the same voice. It was always at night, always calling by name. Some neighbors, frightened, began to report the same experience. Peter, the old fisherman, confessed that he had almost followed the voice to the water, as if he were in a trance. But something inside him managed to break the spell in time. Others weren't so lucky. With each passing night, more people disappeared. Most of them reported hearing the voice before vanishing. They would get up from their beds, leave their houses, and walk toward the sea, like puppets pulled by invisible strings. Those who witnessed these scenes described the disappeared as hypnotized, with vacant stares and firm steps, ignoring any attempt to stop them. My friend Mark, a local policeman, tried to investigate the disappearances. He closely followed the case, listening to reports and visiting the homes of the vanished. One night, he decided to watch the beach. He didn't believe in ghost stories, but he was determined to find out what was happening. Armed with a flashlight and his badge, he stood on the cold sand, observing and waiting. Around midnight, Mark heard the voice. He later described it as something irresistible, a seductive melody that seemed to merge with the sound of the waves. The voice called his name, repeatedly, increasingly urgent. Even he, a skeptical man trained to face danger, felt drawn to the sea. He took a few steps, feeling the cold sand under his feet, but managed to control himself in time. He ran back to town, terrified and trembling. The voice continued to haunt Harbor's End, like a patient predator waiting for its next victims. And with each night, the call seemed to grow stronger, more impossible to resist. The town, once a peaceful refuge, was now a place of fear and uncertainty. The streets were deserted at nightfall, doors locked, and windows sealed. But nothing seemed to stop the voice, which found a way to infiltrate the minds of the residents. The situation became unbearable. Families began to leave the town, fleeing from the terror lurking in the dark waves of the sea. But for those who stayed, each night was a battle against the unknown, a test of will and endurance. And the question that no one dared to ask aloud lingered in the air: who would be next to answer the call of the abyss? With each new disappearance, panic grew. Authorities were helpless, with no concrete clues and no understanding of what they were facing. Fear and paranoia spread like a virus, contaminating every thought and action of the residents. The town was on the verge of collapse, and the voice of the sea continued, relentless, calling, until there was no one left to hear it. My name is Thomas, and I am the last policeman still in Harbor's End. I don't know how much longer I can stay here, but I need to tell you what I discovered. The town was on the brink of despair. The voices kept calling, and each night brought new disappearances. But it was when I started collecting testimonies from the residents who resisted the call that things really got strange. I spoke with Mrs. Thompson, a 70-year-old woman who heard the voice while knitting in her living room. She described the experience as hearing an old friend calling her, someone she deeply trusted. She said she had to grip the arms of her chair so tightly that her nails left marks in the wood, just to stop herself from getting up and following the voice to the sea. Another witness was Jacob, a 19-year-old who almost drowned while swimming at night. He said the voice sounded like a lullaby, sweet and soothing. He fought against the urge to swim further out, managing to get out of the water exhausted and terrified. These accounts confirmed what I suspected. The voice wasn't just a sound. It was a force, something that penetrated people's minds, exploiting their deepest fears and desires. I became obsessed with finding out where it came from and why it was doing this. I decided to investigate local stories and legends. I spent hours in the town's small library, poring over old diaries, ancient newspapers, and anything that could give me a clue. It was there that I found mentions of an old curse, something the local fishermen whispered among themselves but never openly discussed. The legend spoke of a lost ship, the Spirit of Neptune, which sank over 100 years ago. It was said that the crew, in their final desperation, had cursed the waters, vowing to drag anyone who came near the sea to share their fate. The sailors supposedly made a pact with an ocean entity, offering their souls in exchange for revenge against the treacherous sea that condemned them. I thought it was just a story to scare children until I found a diary entry from one of the old residents, dated 1894. He described hearing voices from the sea and the subsequent wave of disappearances in the town. The similarities to what was happening now were disturbing. Determined to get more answers, I went to the old pier where the older fishermen still gathered. It was there that I met Samuel, a man with dark eyes who seemed to know more than he wanted to admit. Reluctantly, he told me about his own encounters with the voice and how he resisted the call. It's not just a voice, lad," he said, his voice hoarse and filled with fear. It's an ancient thing, something that lives in the depths and hates us for being here. It wants to take us to share its misery. Those who hear it and resist, suffer. Those who give in, never come back." Those words haunted me. It was clear that the entity calling from the sea was not just a curse but something alive, conscious, and malevolent. And it was clear that it was getting stronger. In a final desperate attempt to understand, I decided to go to the beach at night, taking with me a recorder and a flashlight. As I walked along the sand, the voice began to call my name, soft and insistent. I pressed the recorder, trying to capture the sound, but it seemed to come from inside my own mind. It was then that I saw it. A shadow in the waters, an indistinct figure that seemed to move with the waves. I felt an almost irresistible pull, but I forced myself to stop and record as much as I could. The voice grew louder, more urgent, and for a moment, I felt I wouldn't be able to resist. Somehow, I managed to pull away, running back to my house. When I listened to the recording later, there was only silence. But I knew what I had heard and seen. The voice was real, the entity was real, and it wouldn't stop until everyone in Harbor's End answered its call. Now, with this new understanding, I know we are fighting something far beyond our comprehension. And I fear the battle is already lost. I am Emily, one of the few still resisting in Harbor's End. And what happened that night on the beach forever changed the way I see the world. We decided it was time to confront directly what was haunting us. Mark, the policeman, gathered a small group of residents who still had enough courage to face the unknown. I joined them, despite the fear gripping my chest. We needed to find the source of the voice and somehow stop the disappearances. That night, the wind was especially cold, and the full moon shone in the sky, casting long, sinister shadows on the sand. We armed ourselves with flashlights, recorders, and the little courage we had left. The plan was simple: spread out along the beach, listen for the voice, and try to follow its trail to the source. The wait was agonizing. The sound of the waves and the rustling leaves kept us on high alert. Finally, around midnight, the voice began. It was like a soft whisper but laden with an almost palpable urgency. Emily. Emily. It called, beckoning me to the sea. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I was determined not to succumb. I looked at Mark, who nodded silently. We started walking toward the water, our feet sinking into the damp sand. The voice grew louder, more insistent, as we approached the water. I looked around and saw the other shadows of the group moving like me, hypnotized by the same macabre melody. It was then that we saw it. A dark figure emerging from the waves, almost indistinguishable against the darkness of the sea. It was a nightmare vision. The figure seemed to float above the water, its form distorted and undefined. From its invisible lips, the voice continued to call, a deadly song that seemed to penetrate directly into our bones. Mark raised his flashlight, trying to illuminate the figure, but the light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness around it. The creature had no face, just a shadow with a pair of bright, empty eyes that seemed to suck in all light and hope. "Stop!" Mark shouted, his voice sounding fragile against the roar of the waves. Who are you? What do you want?" The response came like a distant echo, a voice that seemed to come from all directions at once. "I am the abyss. I am the end." We felt the terror grow inside us. The figure began to move towards us, floating over the water as if there were no gravity. With each step it took, the air around us seemed to get denser, harder to breathe. That's when we realized we were surrounded. Other figures began to emerge from the water, all identical, all calling our names in unison. Terror paralyzed us. We felt as if we were trapped in a nightmare from which we could not wake up. Desperate, we began to retreat, but the quicksand seemed to pull our feet down. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and we began to realize it was not just a sound, but a force that grabbed us, trying to drag us to the sea. Mark, in a last act of desperation, threw the flashlight at the main figure. The light exploded in a bright flash, and for a moment, the creature seemed to retreat. We took that opportunity to run, running as fast as we could back to the safety of solid ground. When we finally reached our homes, we locked doors and windows, trying to block out the voice that still echoed in our heads. We knew we hadn't defeated the entity, just survived another night. That vision, those figures emerging from the sea, the voice that seemed to come from within us, all of it continued to haunt us. Harbor's End was under the dominion of something ancient and relentless, something that wouldn't stop until we were all taken to the abyss. And that night, as I curled up in my bed, I could only think about how many more nights we could resist the call of the sea. I am Mark, the last policeman of Harbor's End. After that night on the beach, the town was on the brink of collapse. The disappearances continued, and the voice of the sea showed no signs of stopping. We were desperate, and I knew that if we didn't do something soon, we would all end up answering the call. I began to spend sleepless nights revisiting everything I had learned about the curse and the entity of the sea. It was then that I came across an old diary, hidden among the dusty books in the library. It belonged to a sailor from the Spirit of Neptune, the ship that supposedly had wrecked and given rise to the curse. The diary described a desperate journey, full of hunger and madness. The crew, trapped in an endless storm, had made a pact with an entity from the depths. In exchange for their lives, they promised to bring more souls to the abyss. The sailor wrote about an ancient ritual, a sacrifice that could appease the entity, but that required a terrible price. I knew this was our last chance. I gathered the few brave ones left in town and explained the plan. We would perform the ritual on the next full moon, trying to seal the entity and end the curse. The preparation was somber. We searched for the ingredients mentioned in the diary: black candles, fish bones, and an ancient amulet I found in the house of one of the missing. On the night of the ritual, we went to the beach. The full moon cast a silver glow over the waves, creating a surreal atmosphere. We felt the weight of what we were about to do. Holding the amulet, I began to recite the words from the diary. The waves seemed to rise in response, and the voice began to call again, louder and more desperate than ever. As I recited, the others positioned themselves around a circle of candles. Suddenly, the figures began to emerge from the sea, just like the previous night. But this time, we were prepared. I held the amulet firmly and continued to recite the words, feeling an increasing energy around me. The main figure appeared, its empty eyes fixed on us. Its voice now sounded like a roar, a lament of centuries of pain and despair. "You cannot stop me," it said, its voice echoing in our minds. "I am the abyss. I am eternal." That was when the final sacrifice had to be made. The diary spoke of a life being offered to seal the curse. I looked at the faces of my companions, all of them ready to fight to the end. But I knew it had to be me. It was my duty as the protector of the town. With the amulet in hand, I stepped into the circle, feeling the presence of the entity envelop me. "Take me," I shouted, "but leave the others in peace." The entity seemed to hesitate for a moment, and then with a final roar, it advanced. I felt a crushing pain as darkness enveloped me. The voices became a chorus of laments, and for a moment, I thought I couldn't bear it. But then, there was a flash of light, and everything went silent. When I woke up, I was on the beach alone. The figures had disappeared, and the sea was calm again. I got up with difficulty, feeling an immense weight of exhaustion and pain. But I knew that somehow, we had succeeded. The voice had stopped. Harbor's End was still in ruins, but the curse had been broken. The few who remained began to rebuild their lives, always remembering the sacrifices made that night. As for me, I carry the marks of what happened, knowing that the abyss will always be there waiting. But at least for now, we had won. And the voice of the sea, at least for a time, had been silenced. My name is Sarah, and I am one of the few survivors of Harbor's End. After Mark made the sacrifice that night, something changed in the town. The voice of the sea finally silenced, and the oppressive feeling that hung over us began to fade. But the scars of what we experienced run deep. In the days that followed, life slowly began to return to normal, if that was even possible. People began to come out of their houses, fishermen returned to the harbor, and daily routine gradually resumed. But the shadow of what had happened remained in our hearts. We tried to console ourselves with the idea that the entity had been sealed forever, but the truth is, no one knew for sure. The sea, which once was a source of sustenance and tranquility, was now viewed with suspicion and fear. No one ventured to fish at night, and stories about the disappearances were whispered rather than told out loud. One morning, when the sun was still low, I found Mark sitting on the beach, staring at the horizon. He looked different, older, as if the weight of what he had done had left deep marks. I sat down beside him, and we remained silent for a while, listening only to the sound of the waves. "Do you think it's really over?" I finally asked, my voice low and full of uncertainty. He sighed, his eyes fixed on the sea. "Yeah, I hope so, Sarah. But something tells me that the abyss never completely disappears. It's always there, waiting for those who dare to come too close." Those words stayed with me, a constant reminder that evil can be silenced, but never completely destroyed. The inhabitants of Harbor's End, however, were resilient. We decided not to let fear control us, even though the memories haunted us. Months later, the town organized a ceremony in memory of the missing. We lit candles and cast flowers into the sea, a gesture of respect and mourning for those who never returned. It was a moment of unity, a way for us to begin healing together. I continued writing about what happened, trying to capture the essence of the terror and courage we experienced. My hope is that by sharing our story, others might understand what we faced and perhaps learn from it. Harbor's End is still a beautiful place, but now it carries a new layer of history, one of suffering and overcoming. And even though the sea continues to murmur its secrets, we, the survivors, have learned to listen cautiously, to respect the forces we do not fully understand. Every sunset, when the colors of the sky reflect on the calm waters, I remember the sacrifice of Mark and all the others who were lost. And I feel a mixture of sadness and gratitude, knowing that despite everything, we managed to survive. Life in Harbor's End will never be the same, but we keep moving forward, honoring those we lost and living with the awareness that the abyss is always present, a part of the world we prefer to forget but can never completely ignore. And so, as the waves continue to crash against the rocks, we continue to live, to love, and to remember, always vigilant, always ready to hear the whispers of the sea.